Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into some truly fascinating and definitely controversial territory. We're breaking down a book by Ryuho Okawa called The Truth Behind World Conflicts. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides, validate, or debunk anything. We're just going to neutrally unpack the exact geopolitical and spiritual arguments presented in this text. And what makes this book such a unique cultural artifact is its, well, incredibly rare approach. It actually attempts to dissect intense, modern global conflicts through the lens of a channeled spiritual medium.
The whole premise of the material we're unpacking today hinges on a really bold claim. The book presents what the author categorizes as a spiritual message, basically a channeled interview with the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad. The stated goal here? To bypass all our modern political rhetoric and uncover the true intentions of Islam, digging into the deep-seated spiritual roots of why major world religions clash. So whether you look at this as religious theology, geopolitical commentary, or just a fascinating piece of alternative media, there is a whole lot to unpack.
To make sense of all this, we're going to follow the book's structure. The original text covers 7 distinct chapters, but for today's explainer, we've grouped those into 6 core themes. 1. Muhammad's current thoughts. 2. Views on war and peace. 3. Terrorism and extremist factions. 4. The global international outlook. 5. Spiritual exchange with Japan. And 6. Advice for happy science.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Muhammad's current thoughts.
So the first question we have to ask is, why is the spirit of Muhammad choosing to speak out right now, in the modern era? Well, the interviewer in the book asks this exactly, trying to figure out how Islam should be perceived by outsiders today. And the text points out a massive modern cognitive dissonance. You see, the word Islam actually shares etymological roots with salam, which literally translates to peace. So the channeled entity is supposedly speaking out to directly address this huge gap, the gap between a foundational concept of peace and the incredibly violent global conflicts that many outsiders associate with the faith today.
Moving on to Section 2, Views on War and Peace.
Okay, so if the root of the religion is peace, how does the text reconcile that with a history that's often seen as really militant? Well, the channeled entity explains this by pointing out a very unique historical position. Unlike other major religious founders, think Jesus or Buddha, who were mainly spiritual teachers totally detached from physical statecraft, Muhammad had a dual role. He was a religious messenger, sure, but he was also a military hero and a literal state builder. The argument the book makes is that you just can't separate the pure spiritual teachings from the brutal, practical realities of building and defending a physical nation in what was a deeply hostile historical environment.
Because I was also a military hero, Muslims do not fear war. According to the book, this historical duality, this embedded bravery, is exactly why the faith appears outwardly belligerent to the rest of the world. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the channeled entity strongly insists that the original intent was never to unjustly persecute anyone or start unprovoked wars of aggression. Instead, it was fundamentally about self-defense. It was about ensuring the literal survival of the early believers when they were completely surrounded by enemies.
That brings us to Section 3, Terrorism and Extremist Factions.
Now, transitioning from historical battles to modern warfare, the original text dives into a deeply sensitive topic. It asks the channeled spirit a very heavy question, point blank. Is suicide terrorism actually permissible or encouraged by the teachings? And the entity responds quite clearly that no, modern suicide terrorism is not explicitly written into the original doctrine. The text frames the concept of jihad simply as a holy war meant solely to protect the faith when it's under an existential threat. So it draws a really sharp theological line between a defensive war and a blanket endorsement of modern terror tactics that indiscriminately target civilians.
Fascinatingly, the text then makes a direct comparison to the Japanese kamikaze forces of World War II. It's a pretty unexpected cross-cultural analogy, right? The channeled spirit argues that dying in such a violent manner doesn't automatically guarantee you a spot in heaven. Instead, the book describes the spiritual mechanism where a person's afterlife destination depends entirely on their individual self-awareness and their true inner intent. So if they are genuinely sacrificing themselves out of a pure desire to protect their homeland from destruction, the spiritual result is vastly different than if they're just acting out of pure, unadulterated hatred for an enemy. Furthermore, the book offers a very specific, nuanced characterization of well-known extremist groups, explaining how they view themselves. It describes the Taliban not just as special military operatives, but fundamentally as strict theological schools, or madrasas, heavily focused on rigid, puritanical doctrine and internal societal control. On the flip side, it characterizes Al-Qaeda as pure fundamentalists who are focused outward. The text asserts that, from their own internal perspective,
These groups absolutely do not see themselves as villains. Rather, they view themselves as righteous, reactionary forces born entirely out of necessary resistance against what they perceive as aggressive, unchecked Western imperialism. Which leads right into Section 4, the Global International Outlook.
This whole theme of resistance ties directly into how the broader Islamic world views the current geopolitical landscape. According to the interview, there's this pervasive existential fear of being totally dismantled or culturally subjugated by Western, historically Christian nations. And this isn't just political. The book frames it as a deeply spiritual crisis. The text highlights a deep-seated resistance to what it calls U.S. imperialism, aggressively pushing Western values and economic systems into the Middle East. Plus, it notes that, from an Arab standpoint, events like the founding of Israel are viewed not just as political disputes, but as inherently unfair historical impositions forced upon them by Western powers, which permanently fuels ongoing regional tension.
Now, for Section 5, Spiritual Exchange with Japan.
So given all this intense global friction, where does a nation like Japan fit into the picture? Well, consider this staggering statistic. Out of Japan's massive population of over 120 million people, there are historically only about 50,000 practicing Muslims. Because of this huge cultural and demographic distance, the author introduces this concept of isolated spiritual ecosystems. The premise here is that the Japanese Shinto and Buddhist spiritual realms and the Islamic spiritual realms have almost zero historical overlap. Therefore, spiritual crossover, meaning the literal reincarnation of souls moving back and forth between these two distinct cultures, is incredibly rare. The text basically argues they're operating on two entirely different spiritual frequencies.
And finally, Section 6, Advice for Happy Science.
Because of this profound lack of spiritual connection, the final part of the source material outlines direct advice for the author's own Japanese religious organization, Happy Science. And the strategy proposed is highly ambitious. It starts with finding a shared foundation. You see, Islam's Quran is based on the vocal transmission of divine words to a prophet, a concept that's fundamentally similar to Happy Science's own core practice of channeling spiritual messages. Once that bridge of communication is open, the next step involves reaching out to educate globally minded, economically stable Muslims who already understand Western and Japanese cultures. From there, the ultimate goal is huge. By acting as a cultural and spiritual bridge, this modern Japanese religion hopes to gently aid in the modernization of ancient Islamic practices, aiming to ease the friction with the Western world.
Ultimately, the core underlying message from this entire spiritual interview is a plea for understanding. The channeled spirit says, "I want the world to know that Islam is not a teaching of the devil." The source material insists that despite the sheer volume of violence dominating our global news cycles, the foundational intent of the religion is not inherently evil. The entity is essentially asking the world to take a step back from viewing these massive cultural clashes purely in black and white good versus evil terms, and instead to seek a deeper, more nuanced theological empathy. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. Whether or not you buy into the spiritual and channeled nature of these claims, the text does leave us with a really compelling question to ponder. Is understanding the deepest, unvarnished religious motivations, how people fundamentally view their own faith and their perceived enemies, the actual missing key to finally resolving world conflicts? Thank you so much for joining us as we explored this material. We really hope it gives you a whole new framework to think about these complex global issues.
Okay, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a highly controversial, but honestly, deeply fascinating text by Ryuho Okawa called The Truth Behind World Conflicts. Now, our goal here is to completely impartially unpack its bold claims. Whether you agree with its premises or absolutely not, the way this book attempts to explain complex geopolitical struggles through this esoteric, multidimensional lens is just incredibly unique. We're going to break down exactly how this text frames modern history, mapping out its arguments so we can really understand what it's trying to say.
So, the core premise of this book is, well, it's not your standard political science treatise, that's for sure. Instead, it presents a spiritual debate. The author claims to actually channel the spirits of major historical and religious figures. We're talking specifically about Archangel Michael, who's represented as the protective force of America and Christianity, and Muhammad, the founder of Islam. The text essentially uses these channeled messages as a framework to explain the hidden spiritual realities behind modern geopolitics and clashes of civilization. To make sense of this massive scope, we're going to cover 5 key areas today: wars for global justice, evaluating President Obama, Islam, Christianity, and rights, spirits of the ninth dimension, and finally, Earth from a cosmic perspective. All right, let's get into Section 1, Wars for Global Justice.
The text's core assertion here is that the spirit of Archangel Michael views the modern military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan not as political blunders, but as an absolutely uncompromising fight for global justice. In the text, Michael references the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, arguing that if the world's strongest nation just sat back and did nothing, similar tragedies would multiply. The stance here is relentless. Justice and what the text calls God's will must be pursued literally regardless of the economic or physical toll.
Building on that idea, the text explicitly assigns America a spiritual mandate. According to the book, America is fundamentally required to act as the world's police. Now, this isn't just about foreign policy. The author frames it as a cosmic necessity to provide a deterrent force. The text argues that without this strong, sometimes military pushback, what it defines as evil and terrorism would go completely unchecked, just spreading across the globe.
Moving right along to Section 2, Evaluating President Obama.
So the text takes a very specific view of President Obama, noting his tendency to retreat from conflicts in the Middle East and seek appeasement. But what's really fascinating is why the text claims he does this. It asserts that his soul is deeply tied to historically oppressed minorities, specifically mentioning the spirits of Africans and Native Americans. Because of this spiritual empathy for marginalized groups, the book claims his natural instinct is to pull back from that aggressive world police role and focus instead on healing past wrongs.
But here's the crucial point the text makes next. It's about the office of the presidency itself. The author argues that regardless of a leader's personal soul history or their natural inclination toward empathy, taking the oath of office comes with an unavoidable geopolitical mission. The book suggests that the U.S. presidency has a fundamental duty to maintain global order that simply cannot be abandoned, even if the person in power deeply personally wishes to step away from military conflict.
Okay, Section 3, Islam, Christianity, and rights. Historically, most world religions have life cycles of, 2,000 or 3,000 years. However, Islam is created a mere 600 years after Christianity. The author argues that having two major world religions existing simultaneously so close together in their historical timelines inevitably leads to deep structural friction. It's kind of like a spiritual turf war that the text suggests was basically baked into the timeline from the 7th century onward.
Now, we must impartially note that the text takes a very specific and highly controversial stance here. The book asserts that Christian civilization is currently better equipped to advance human evolution. It argues that modern concepts of human rights and freedom were championed by the West, while it critiques Islamic civilization as currently lacking innovation and, in its view, sometimes suppressing basic human rights through ancient penal practices.
To justify this stance on human rights, the book goes all the way back to the Old Testament. It highlights the concept of God breathing life into humanity. The text argues that because humans possess this breath, like a piece of the divine, a divine spark, we must act like civilized beings. According to the author, this divine spark is the true foundation of human rights, meaning humanity has to reject barbaric practices and continuously evolve toward a more enlightened state.
Let's dive into Section 4, Spirits of the Ninth Dimension.
This requires a massive paradigm shift. If earthly beings, presidents, nations, entire civilizations are just players on a board, well, it begs a huge question. Who exactly is giving the orders? The text claims there is a vast, unseen spiritual bureaucracy managing human affairs. So let's look at how it breaks down this chain of command.
The book claims there is a very distinct division of labor up in the spirit world. Entities in the 8th dimension, like Archangel Michael, act as the heads of practical affairs. Think of them like military chiefs of staff. They make judgments, give commands, and actively manage the defense of civilizations. On the other hand, the 9th dimension entities operate entirely differently. They do not micromanage at all. The text compares them to kings or emperors, providing broad directional oversight and observing the grand scheme without getting bogged down in daily tactical skirmishes.
To put it simply, these ninth-dimensional entities are portrayed as the ultimate spiritual architects of our world. They are the ones who assigned missions to major figures, set the grand timeline of religions, and hold the ultimate authority over Earth's evolutionary path. They represent the macro vision, while the 8th dimension handles the messy, day-to-day realities of planetary management.
And finally, Section 5, Earth from a Cosmic Perspective. Here is where the text expands its scope wildly, introducing literal extraterrestrial elements. It even mentions groups like reptilians, stating that there are souls with origins from other parts of the universe currently here on Earth.
The book suggests that the grand spiritual hierarchy is actually managing the assimilation of these cosmic souls into Earth civilization, basically trying to integrate their unique traits into our ongoing human experiment.
This striking quote really captures the ruthless nature of this cosmic management, attributed to the protective spirits managing Earth's progress. They literally view themselves as surgeons. From their vast cosmic viewpoint, cultures, practices, or civilizations that resist progress and cling to what the text calls ancient regressions are seen as diseases that delay planetary evolution. A surgeon must cut these away so the host, meaning Earth, can survive and grow.
Ultimately, the text builds to this grand conclusion. The claim is that all of this, the brutal wars in the Middle East, the clashing of massive religions, the invisible spiritual hierarchy, it is all aimed at a single cosmic goal. Earth is being forced to evolve. The spiritual management wants to elevate our civilization so we can officially join a broader galactic community. To do this, the text argues, we absolutely must eliminate ancient, regressive behaviors and move entirely beyond flesh and blood tribalism and primitive conflicts.
Which leaves us with a truly wild thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If we view our earthly geopolitical struggles through this highly esoteric cosmic lens, treating wars and cultural clashes as the surgical growing pains of a planet being pushed to evolve, what exactly is holding our civilization back? What are the ancient regressions we are supposedly meant to cut off next to join the wider universe? It is a fascinating, if provocative, framework to consider. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.